Yukon, Oklahoma, was a quiet town. The kind of place where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and neighbors looked out for one another. It was home to the Candy family, a seemingly happy household that lived in a well-maintained suburban home. At the center of the family was Jonathon Candy, 42 years old, a man known for his dedication to his family and work. His wife, Lindsay Candy, 39, was described by those who knew her as a kind and nurturing mother. Together, they were raising their 4 sons, Dylan, 18, Ethan, 14, Lucas, 12, and their youngest, just 10 years old. Jonathon and Lindsay had been married for years, building a life centered around their children. Jonathon was employed in a stable job, reportedly working long hours to provide for his family. Lindsay was a dedicated mother, active in their children's lives and always present at school functions and sporting events. Their home was filled with warmth, decorated with family pictures and memories of vacations, birthdays, and milestones. From the outside, the Candace appeared to be a normal, loving family, one that no one would have suspected was heading toward a horrific tragedy. Neighbors described Jonathon as a devoted father, the kind of man who made sure his kids had everything they needed. He attended his sons' baseball games, helped with homework, and participated in community events. Lindsay was equally involved, often seen dropping off or picking up the kids from school and organizing family outings. To those who knew them, they were a model family, deeply committed to each other. Despite the pressures of work and parenting, there were no outward signs of trouble. Jonathon had no known history of violence. There were no police reports, no domestic disturbances, nothing that would suggest what was to come. Friends and relatives later recalled that Lindsay never mentioned being afraid of her husband. The couple had a reputation for being private, but nothing seemed amiss. Then, on the night of April 21, 2024, something changed. The home that had once been filled with the laughter of children and the normal sounds of family life would soon become the scene of an unthinkable crime. The events of that night would leave a community in shock and a young boy, their youngest son, the sole survivor of a tragedy no child should ever have to endure. The next morning, a 911 call would come in, made by the 10-year-old child, setting off a police investigation that would reveal a devastating reality, one that no one saw coming. It was the night of April 21, 2024, when everything changed inside the Candy family home. It was a typical evening, with no immediate signs of the horror that would soon unfold. The family had gone about their routine as usual. The children were home, and Lindsay was finishing up household tasks. Jonathon, like most nights, was present in the home. There was no argument overheard by neighbors, no loud noises reported before the night took a dark turn. At some point during the late hours, Jonathon Candy made a decision that would alter the lives of his family forever. With no warning, he carried out a brutal attack. Lindsay, his wife of many years, was the first victim. The details of the attack were later described as shockingly violent. He had shot his wife and killed her on the spot. She never had a chance to call for help. After Lindsay was murdered, for some inexplicable reason, Jonathon turned his attention to their sons, Dylan, Ethan, and Lucas. Each one was targeted in a manner that suggested premeditation rather than impulse. The crime scene would later reveal that they never had a chance to escape. Amid the horror, one child survived. The youngest, just 10 years old, was left alive. It remains unclear whether Jonathon deliberately spared him or if something interrupted his plan. Investigators later tried to understand why he was the only survivor. He was the one who would later make the 911 call, his voice filled with terror as he tried to explain what had happened. The call was received early in the morning, and dispatchers immediately sensed the urgency. Police were sent to the scene within minutes. What they found inside the home was described as one of the most disturbing crime scenes Yukon, Oklahoma, had ever witnessed. Officers quickly secured the house, ensuring that the sole surviving child was safe. In the initial moments of the investigation, officers believed they were dealing with a potential home invasion. Had an intruder broken in? Had the family been targeted by someone from the outside? But as they searched the house and pieced together the sequence of events, it became clear that the crime was committed by someone inside the home. Jonathon Candy was the primary suspect. With his wife and 3 children dead, and only one child left alive. The manhunt for Jonathon began immediately. Officers were dispatched to search the surrounding areas. Law enforcement contacted nearby jurisdictions, concerned that he might flee the state. They needed to find him before anyone else got hurt. What had driven Jonathon Candy to commit such an unthinkable crime? That was the question detectives needed to answer. As authorities arrived at the Candy family home, the scene inside was one of devastation. Officers entered cautiously, unsure of what they would find. The initial 911 call had indicated multiple victims, but the full scale of the tragedy was yet to be uncovered. Moving through the house, they discovered the bodies of Lindsay Candy and 3 of her children. Each had suffered fatal injuries, their lives taken in what appeared to be a calculated act of violence. The home, once filled with family moments, was now a silent crime scene. Then, in another room, officers found Jonathon Candy. Unlike his wife and 3 children, he was still alive but unresponsive. He had inflicted the same fate upon himself. His injuries were severe, and it was clear that he had made a final, irreversible decision after carrying out the attack on his family. Emergency responders quickly assessed the situation. Jonathon was still breathing, but his pulse was weak. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but his injuries were too extensive. Shortly after arrival, he was pronounced dead. The only survivor in the house was the youngest child, who had somehow been spared. Authorities found the child in a separate room, unharmed but deeply traumatized. He was immediately taken into protective custody and placed in the care of relatives while investigators worked to piece together what had happened. Detectives processed the crime scene with precision. Every piece of evidence needed to be documented. Blood patterns, the positioning of the bodies, any potential signs of a struggle. Forensic teams worked carefully, ensuring no detail was overlooked. The murder weapon was recovered near Jonathon, confirming that no outside intruder had been involved. Word of the crime spread quickly throughout Yukon. Neighbors and friends were in disbelief. The Candy family had seemed happy. No outward signs of turmoil, no known history of domestic violence. Investigators now faced a pressing question. What had driven Jonathon Candy to commit such an unthinkable act? The autopsy report would later confirm that Jonathon had died from self-inflicted injuries. No substances were found in his system that could explain his actions. In the absence of an immediate motive, detectives turned their attention to his personal and financial records, searching for any hidden stressors that might have led to this tragedy. But for now, one thing was certain. 4 lives had been lost, and a town was left searching for answers. With the crime scene processed and forensic evidence collected, investigators turned their attention to understanding why Jonathon Candy had committed such an unthinkable act. There was no history of domestic violence, no prior reports of conflict severe enough to suggest a breaking point. Friends and relatives struggled to comprehend how a man who had always seemed devoted to his wife and children could carry out such a violent attack. Detectives began piecing together the family's recent history. They examined Jonathon's financial records, employment situation, and any potential stressors that could have contributed to his actions. His job performance had reportedly been steady, and there was no record of significant debt or legal trouble. However, investigators did find some indications of personal strain. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Jonathon had displayed subtle but noticeable behavioral changes. Co-workers later reported that he had seemed withdrawn and unfocused. At home, there were reports that he had been increasingly distant. Lindsay had confided in a close friend that she was concerned about her husband's emotional state, but she never expressed fear for her safety. No one could have predicted what would ultimately unfold. As detectives interviewed those closest to Jonathon, a pattern of emotional distress began to emerge. Family members described a man who had always been responsible, but had recently seemed burdened by something he wouldn't discuss. One relative recalled a conversation in which Jonathon made an offhand remark about feeling overwhelmed, but quickly brushed it off. Investigators considered whether he had been struggling with an undiagnosed mental health issue. The forensic analysis of Jonathon's devices offered further insight. His internet search history revealed an interest in cases of familicide, instances where individuals had taken the lives of their own families before ending their own. This disturbing discovery suggested that the crime may not have been an impulsive act, but rather something he had contemplated. Psychological experts brought in to analyze the case noted that such crimes often stem from a sense of despair or perceived failure. Some individuals who commit familicide believe they are sparing their loved ones from future suffering. Whether Jonathon had convinced himself of such a rationale remained unknown. No suicide note was found, leaving behind only speculation. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Lindsay's family publicly expressed their grief and disbelief. They described her as a loving mother who dedicated her life to her children. They struggled to understand how the man she trusted could be responsible for such devastation. Meanwhile, the youngest surviving child remained in the care of extended family members. Authorities ensured that he was shielded from the intense media attention surrounding the case. Counselors were brought in to help him process the trauma, though it was clear that the scars of that night would never fully heal. As the investigation progressed, the lack of a clear-cut motive left lingering questions. There was no single event that could explain Jonathon's decision. Instead, the case pointed to a series of internal struggles that had remained hidden until it was too late. In the days following the tragedy, the quiet community of Yukon, Oklahoma, was left in shock. Residents struggled to comprehend how a family that seemed so ordinary could have been the center of such devastation. Local news outlets covered the story extensively, reporting on the investigation's progress while also respecting the privacy of surviving family members. Candlelight vigils were held in memory of Lindsay Candy and her children, with friends and neighbors gathering to mourn their loss. Law enforcement officials formally closed the case after confirming that Jonathon Candy had acted alone. Autopsy reports confirmed the cause of death for each victim, and forensic evidence left no doubt that the crime was premeditated. Investigators stated that there was no evidence of external involvement, and with Jonathon deceased, there would be no trial or further legal proceedings. The official conclusion was that this was a case of familicide, an act that had no clear or singular explanation. The media's focus soon shifted to discussions about mental health and the warning signs that had gone unnoticed. Psychologists and criminologists were consulted to provide insight into cases like this, where individuals commit acts of extreme violence against their own families. Some experts pointed out that while financial or personal stressors often contribute to such tragedies, there was still no definitive way to predict them. They emphasized the importance of early intervention and mental health support. Meanwhile, Lindsay's surviving child remained under the care of extended relatives. Authorities and social workers worked closely with the family to ensure that he received the necessary emotional and psychological support. Given the high-profile nature of the case, measures were taken to protect his privacy as much as possible. His well-being became a primary concern for those who stepped in to care for him, ensuring that he had stability in the wake of immense loss. As time passed, members of the community began working on ways to honor the victim's memory. A scholarship fund was established in Lindsay's name, dedicated to supporting students pursuing careers in early childhood education, a field she had been passionate about. Friends and former colleagues contributed to the initiative, ensuring that her dedication to children's development would not be forgotten. Additionally, an annual memorial event was created to raise awareness about domestic violence and mental health struggles, encouraging open discussions about recognizing and addressing signs of distress. Despite these efforts to find meaning in the tragedy, questions remained unanswered. The absence of a suicide note left a gap in understanding Jonathon Candy's mindset in the moments leading up to the crime. Speculation persisted, but there was no definitive explanation for why a man who had once been a loving father and husband had resorted to such an act. Years later, the case continued to serve as a sobering reminder of how the struggles some individuals face can remain hidden until it is too late. It became a point of reference in discussions about mental health awareness, prompting some members of the community to advocate for better access to counseling services and crisis intervention programs. While the answers sought by the victims' loved ones would never fully come, their memory lived on in those who carried their legacy forward. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to be notified as we add new videos daily. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching.